Today we're going to continue working on our big 24 by 36 inch canvas. This again is by far the largest canvas we've ever done here on the channel, and it's really fulfilling. I feel like we have so much more room for detail, for realism, and today specifically we're going to work on the distant water. We're going to work on a lot of the grass in the midground. We're going to interject a lot of sand and rocks and make it as real as we can with a very unconventional application style. So stick around and enjoy. If you missed part 1 or part 2 where we worked on the clouds, the sky, the distant mountains, or the rocks, I'll have all of that linked in the video description, where you can also find all of the tools, materials, paints, everything we use to craft today's lesson. And before we jump into it, I would like to say a big thank you to all of the Patreon supporters. It is truly because of you that we were able to do these big lessons, that we're able to put this much time and effort into a piece, and I really can't thank you enough because I'm really enjoying this. With that, if you would like to also support the channel, you can find a link to Patreon in the video description, where you can also find the traceable, the reference photos, a bunch of bonus hour-long lessons, our exclusive Facebook page, a bunch of different things. Go check it out. And also, with that, I have no more things to say, which is great because it means we can hop into the painting lesson. So here is a bit of a wide shot just to show you what we did here in week 1 with the sky, week 2 down with the rocks and mountains. Now week 3 we are going to work on the water and then work our way into the foreground. In regards to what paints we'll be using, all of the materials will be listed in the video description. However, here I do have a titanium white, a Mars black, cobalt blue, burnt umber, cadmium red deep hue, cadmium yellow deep hue, and then I have a sap green as well. All of these are Liquitex basics, and that right there is a Winsor and Newton. With that, as per usual, I'm going to begin by taping my reference photos to my canvas. That way I can paint directly on them and test colors before applying them and committing to them on the actual canvas. So now we're actually going to begin, and I'm going to use my 1-inch flat-headed brush for this because it can cut across these sharp edges and carry a good amount of paint. Now, I always begin by making sure that my brush is nice and damp. That way I can extend the wet life of my paint, blend with it longer, drag it farther, do all of those very important things when you're working on a larger canvas. And now we need to actually mix our color. So water, as a good just general tip, is always slightly darker than the colors in the sky. So what we can actually do, we can use a reference photo, we can actually go to the watercolor, or we can go to the sky and just try to mix something a little bit darker. Now my sky is comprised of this cobalt blue, we have a hint of Mars black, and I grabbed a lot, so I'm just taking the excess off here around the black on my palette. I'll move that in, and then I'll use the corner to kind of lift off some titanium white as well. Now we'll bring all of this together, and I'll get a really nice blend. I'm trying to make sure that it's consistent all the way around, and it's consistent on all edges of my brush. That way, when I go to apply it, one area isn't darker or lighter than another. So here we have a blue. We can test it in our sky, just actually apply it, see how it works, blend it out. And that actually was quite close. We can also test it here on our reference photo. Again, quite close. I think I want it to be a hint darker and maybe a hint more saturated because it's going to move forward in the painting. So I'll grab a little bit more Mars black and a little bit more blue to give it that additional saturation. Mix it through well, and now I'll go down and I'll test it and I'll see how it actually looks. I'm starting on the sharper edge here of my subject. And I always like to do this because when you're first applying paint, you have the most paint on your brush that you will. You have the most clean, sharp applications, or opportunity to create them rather, because again, you have that water. And then as you start to use more and more, the paint, as you can see, it gets a bit more chalky. You can see the tooth of the canvas showing through. And at that point, I just like to use the excess paint to start filling in areas. So I work the edges first, and then when I don't have a lot of control with my paint, I just fill in. Let's do more. Now, I like to work generally in the angle, the stroke of the subject. So if we're working on a tree and we're working on the trunk of it, generally moves vertically. I like to paint vertically. Water generally moves horizontally, one direction or another, so I'm moving my brush horizontally. Now I don't want a lot of brush strokes showing through in this, but should they, it's good if they're facing a proper direction. Now I have some paint here, but it's just about run out. I always like to mix minimal amounts to begin, because it ensures that I'll go back and I'll remix more. It's good practice in mixing color, and it makes sure that the next time I go to my painting, I have a good understanding of how I got those colors so I can recreate them. It's just building good practice, good memory, and whatnot. And I like to remix my colors on top of previous colors, leaving the edges. That way I can see what I'm mixing towards. I think I have something quite consistent there. Coming back in, just filling in that area that I left. And I'm going over some of these areas a good number of times. And that's important because acrylics are semi-transparent, and generally a single layer, especially when mixed with a little bit of water, just won't be enough. Got some more. Again, I have fresh paint on my brush, so I'm going back, I'm working on the edging. You can see how I'm rotating my brush, and I'm just trying to use that sharp, longer edge to consistently deliver paint. I'm not getting lazy with it, I'm continuously rotating and just finding the best angles to deliver that pigment. Let's move a little bit closer so you can see more in depth how my brush strokes are working, how I'm going over things. So here we are, we're a little bit closer, and I'm looking at it from afar. And I feel like it might be a little bit too saturated. If you look at it in comparison with the mountains, what's beside it, the sky. And so what do we do when we feel something's too saturated? We add a little bit more gray to it. So I'll take a bit more titanium white, a bit more Mars black. We will use more blue, but I'll mix on top yet again, this time leaving that edge and attempting to create a slightly different, more gray version. I really like the brightness. I think that the value is quite good. I just think it needs to be a bit more subtle. And as we move forward in the painting, we can start to create slightly more saturation. So that right there, it's about the same brightness, it's quite similar, but it's definitely more grayed. So I'll use this, and I'll start applying it right down here. Went over my rock a little bit, that's okay, we can always go back in and redraw that. And then I'll move it up into the previous applications of water. And I'm starting in a new area, that way I have it unblended with anything else. I can see what it truly looks like. If we started in there, it would mix with the previously applied wet pigment, and we wouldn't have a fully accurate reading of what it actually looks like on the canvas. So, again, off to a good start. We need significantly more paint. Again, remixing. And as I continuously remix the same pigment, I start to mix slightly more each time because I become more comfortable with that mixture. I feel like I mentally hold on to more of it, and I don't feel like I need as much practice. So, progressively, just making a little bit more. We can move about, and I like to do this occasionally. I like to jump around the canvas when working on a similar pigment, a similar application, just because we tend to get really comfortable with our applications, with how we're applying things. And by moving about, you ensure that things don't look too monotonous, because you have to change how you're standing, you have to change your stroke a little bit, you have to change your techniques to work around different things. And here I'm working around my tree still. Not all of the branches individually, because that would just be very time consuming, but around the general body of it. And then here I still have a lot of sharp, clean paint on my brush, so I'm working around my rocks. There we go.
Now where my water meets my land, I'm trying to create a bit of a softer blend. I don't want a truly hard line, and I don't want a lot of paint building up there and creating a texture, which can happen when you create a line because you make a stroke and that paint is pushed to either edge of your canvas, rather either end of your brush, and it can create something that's a little voluminous and textured, and you don't really want that, especially in the background. So I just try to smooth that out, and then I go over all of these applications again with this very soft stroke. The less pressure you incorporate with your brush, the more of a soft application you'll get. I'm apparently filming this a little bit too early, so I'm slipping on my words already. I suppose that's the challenge of an artist. You wake up and you don't go to work necessarily, you go to the canvas and the easel and you just start talking for the first time. So you get my morning mannerisms as well. There we go. You can apply paint in a non-horizontal stroke, but then before it dries, just go back over it with those horizontal strokes and it'll be all the same. Grab more of that paint. We mixed quite a bit of it, so as you can see, we're covering a fair amount of surface area in this application, which is quite nice. The tree has this general shape. There we go. And then we'll work our way around the land while we still have some sharp paint. Now I'm running out, so I'm just moving that in however I like. Let's mix some more paint. It's also important to note that at this point it's all looking quite flat because we don't have a gradient, because we're not moving light across it yet, because there isn't a change in saturation yet. We're just building a simple base layer, making sure that we have a thick layer of paint on the canvas that we can build on later. Now here, I'm getting closer to the foreground, so I might make this a little bit brighter and a little bit more saturated. But I don't want it to be dramatic. I actually want a lot of this to be quite subtle. Can make the back a little bit darker, compensate in a different way. You don't always have to make the front brighter and more saturated. If you feel like it's already bright and saturated, you can just make the back a little bit less saturated and a little bit less bright. But you can see it's very minor how much I'm changing this, and I'd highly recommend changing these things to a very minor degree, at least initially. Just test things, see how it works, and then if you like it, commit to it, and then you can do more. It's very much like mixing our paints. Again, I start with a very minimal amount. Once I figure out what I like, then I kind of double down on it, and I use significantly more. There we go. I feel like I have a bit of a harder dark edge right there. So I'm just peeling down and then working horizontally. Let's move a little bit closer. We'll take our mixture, we'll throw in some extra blue, some extra white. This time no extra black. We'll just make it a little bit more poppy. There we go. That looks really nice. I'm blending it up into my previous application, and a good way of doing that is to take some of that paint, move it up in an X pattern, like that, and then you go back and forth over it horizontally. That way it does move up quite a bit, and in the end, it moves in the direction you want it to. Again, combining these areas through an X pattern. And then in the end, horizontal. So right now we have a very, very subtle change from the light to the dark, but you can still see it. And because it's in the background, we actually want this to be quite subtle. This area right here might be a little bit darker from a bit of a shadow there, or maybe we have light moving through. I think if the light moves through this way, this area would get a hint of shadow. And then this area right here, on the reference photo, looks like a lot of beach. So, I'm actually going to leave that open. That way we can paint our sand and our beach, and then we can paint water going over it, make it semi-transparent, and look really three-dimensional. I'm going to kind of conclude this area by mixing my color to match this, and then I'll apply that right down here at the bottom. So I'll take some titanium white. It looks quite bright. It looks a bit desaturated as well. So we'll just start with some white because that will brighten it and desaturate it. I'll test that up here. As you can see, it's really quite close. I think it needs a hint more brightness and it needs a hint more saturation. Okay, giving it another shot. Now I think it needs just more saturation. We added more white, which did desaturate it more. And that's perfect. Okay, so let's get a good bit of it because it'll blend with what we just applied. And oh, that's pretty. And now we can apply this very happily, knowing that we have a thick base layer and that we're just perfecting it. We're not worried about building it up. We're just making it exactly what we want it to be. And as you can see, I just continuously move it up. I'm going to continue doing that until I fully run out of paint. There we go. Let's mix a bit more. Again, I'm going to mix down and I'm going to leave this edge. That way I know what I'm mixing to. It's all just a process of asking yourself, what does this need? Right now it's a bit too desaturated, so we'll add some blue. It's closer. It's a bit too dark there, so we'll add some white. Now what is it? Again, I think too saturated, we'll add blue. And this is why it's so important to remember that Mars Black is such a dominant pigment. You add a little bit of it, and it's quickly stronger than everything else. So you need to work it slowly in small amounts. I think we just found the pigment right there. Maybe a little bit brighter, maybe a hint more saturation. And let's head back down. That looks like it. Remember that the application that we just worked on was blending with the previously applied blue. So it wasn't perfect. But as we talked about in the rocks and the sky, I want a slightly more heightened version of the reference photo. I want more contrast, I want a bit more saturation, more color. So I'm going to have this more dramatic change from dark to light. And right now I'm blending wet into dry by using a fairly damp brush. I wipe off the excess water. You don't want it to actually be wet, you just want it to be damp. And now I'm blending this wet layer up over my dry layer. And I'm having it dissipate as we move higher and higher up in the canvas. There we go. Now if you add too much wet paint over a semi-dry area like here and here, sometimes it can start peeling off that paint. And this only happens really as the paint's drying. Once it's fully dry, you don't have to worry about it at all. So you might want to wait for yours to dry a little bit longer. As you can see, it started to rip a little bit of paint off mine. That's okay. I think what I'm going to do with that though, I'm going to let it dry fully, and then I'll come back to it in a little bit and just paint over that area. But as far as the rest of the water goes, I like it. It's three-dimensional, it's subtle, it's really pretty. I think we did a great job there. Actually, you know what? I look at this in contrast with this, and this is significantly more saturated than that. I might go back and desaturate that slightly. So black, blue, work that into our current mixture. Definitely need more blue. Again, it's all about little course corrections. Just grab some actual blue, we'll blend it on the canvas right here. Need to be careful as we go over these areas. But again, if you have that issue, I would recommend letting it dry. Just been doing this for a long time and I have a good idea of how to combat it. That actually turned out really nice. And now this side actually works very cohesively with our rocks. So it's all fixed. Great. From there, we're going to take a step back, look at it as a whole, and then we can come in and start working on the foreground.
So here we have a significantly wider shot, which is quite important to look at this point, because what we really want to do is compare and contrast our water with our sky, because again, as a good just general rule, you really want to ensure that your water is slightly darker than that sky color, which I think we actually achieved quite well here. Now, again, that's a general rule, and I would like to kind of preface all of this with the fact that it does have its exceptions. Sometimes when you are painting, say, a moonlit scene, and there's a really bright reflection of a moon coming down and streaming through the water, sometimes that is quite bright, but the majority of the body of water should be slightly darker. So this is what we've achieved right here. I think it looks quite nice. It's still a little bit reflective, so it looks a little bit more like water because it actually is wet. As it dries, it'll get more of the consistency of the rest of the painting. But I did touch it up a little bit since the last shot, and I just tried to match the color that we have here in the mountain right down here. I don't want it to be a perfect match, I just wanted it to be a little bit closer. So I just brightened that up a little bit. And now we can really continue by working down here in the grassy areas. So now I've reapplied my reference photo for this area right here. And as you can see, it has a lot of greens, it has this nice golden sandy rock color, and that's really what we're going to be focusing on here next. However, our water is quite blue right now. And if we mixed any yellows for those sandy areas with this, we'd get more greens, and we wouldn't get a true kind of gold that we might want. So I'm going to clean my water really well, I'm going to clean my brush really well, then we'll come back in and we'll start working on this area. So, as an update, we just finished the water and we were going to move into the grass. However, this clip is actually filmed far in the future. I painted the grass and I filmed it and I thought it looked fine, but then I went over and I painted the grass on the right-hand side of the canvas. I kind of discovered a new technique that I thought you would definitely benefit from. So, we're kind of going back in time now. I covered up the grass that I just painted, that I just taught. I covered up the rocks that I just taught, and I think what we'll do now, we'll redo it, and I'll show you a better way. So, to begin, I'm actually starting the grass here with a very dark application. I covered this up with an almost black instead of a white because I actually want to start with a darker base layer. And I'll show you how I mixed this and how you can get to it. So I start here with a little bit of Mars black. I take some of our Cobalt blue, a fair amount really, almost half and half. I grab a hint of burnt umber, maybe a quarter of what I took in the blue. And then I grab maybe a fifth of that with titanium white. And the titanium white's going to thicken it, it's going to make it more of a gray. There we go. And what you really want to do, you want to match this
semi-close to what you had in the rocks from the previous week. Now that's a little bit too dark, so I'll just throw a little bit more titanium white in there. Ended up being quite a bit titanium white. We'll do a little bit more Mars black. I'll test that. It's a little bit gray. We'll throw some extra blue in it. Some extra Mars black again. And we'll just course correct until we get the right value and the right hue. And I just keep testing it back here. That actually looks quite nice. So, that's how I mix it. And I'll apply it over these rocks, which we can repaint together. So I'm just using the sharp edge of my brush to go over and in front of these. And then I'm doing a little bit of a blend down. And then I'll blend it into the rest of my paint. The majority of this is dried, and as acrylic paint dries, it gets a little bit darker, so it probably will look a little bit darker than that on camera, but that's okay. We'll just do a nice subtle blend from one into the other. And then from there, what we need to do, we need to let the entirety of this darker strip dry. So I covered everything up into the stream. I covered it up into the rock. And then I left a little area down here for more of a stream. So at this point, just use this very dark mixture, fill that in, let it dry, and then we can go back in and start working on the grass. I know this is a strange process of going about it, but it works really, really well, and I was so pleased when I kind of actually figured it out for the first time over on the right-hand side of the canvas. So here's a bit of a closer look. My almost black pigment here has dried. I cleaned my water while it did, and I switched over to this smaller round-headed brush, which is about 1/8 of an inch. And I like this because it delivers a very soft application and it creates really good blends. Now, I'm going to take this, and I'm going to kind of isolate different areas. So, this area on my reference photo right here is this area on my painting right here. This is this rock, and then this will be green, it will be sand, it will be more of that. And that's essentially what I want to do. So, I'm going to start by wetting my brush, going to head over here into my palette, and I'll take some of my sap green, move that out here, and you can tell it's very saturated right now. We want something that's significantly less so. So I'll take some titanium white because that will desaturate the pigment. It'll also brighten it a great deal, but I don't want it too bright, so I'll take a hint of Mars black, work that in there. And we'll start with this because it's fairly neutral, it's fairly dark, and we'll try testing it on our reference photo. It's a little bit dark, but it's quite close, so I'll add some extra titanium white. That, of course, took out some saturation. We'll throw in some of that sap green again. We'll try this. And that really is nice and close. So, now I'm going to look for distinct features in this area. And if I look to the bottom of the rock, there's this larger patch right there. So I'll kind of articulate where the bottom of my rock is. And I will start painting out from there. And just like that, I have that little shape. Now I notice there's another one that kind of works its way around the rock, but there's this bit of sand in between the two. So I will paint this and just fill it in again in the same way. I'm looking for little divots, little movements. And this will make the painting so much more interesting than what it would have been had we only painted with a very basic green grass. Instead, we'll have all of this rocks and sand, and it'll feel really, really complex down here. Now, I want to start working in some of the sand while this is still slightly wet. That way I can do some blends. So I'll take some of my burnt umber, move that right here on my palette. I want it to be significantly brighter. So I'll take a lot of titanium white, move that over close to it. Slowly grab hints of that burnt umber, move it in. That way I can really control how much of it is blending with the titanium white. And I'll give this a try. It's really quite nice. So we'll take this and I'll start moving it in and around our green application here. So there's that little trail that you can see, and then it goes up again, and then it goes out in a couple of different directions, like that. It's actually really, really cathartic to paint. Going back and forth between the two and just kind of finding the lines and angles. Here's a larger patch of sand. It's not so line heavy like those were. So I'm going to the edge and I'm making sure I cover all of that black. That way it doesn't look like I have a bit of an outline. And then I'll work my way in here. Down, find more of that sand. And I'm allowing the paint to dissipate on my brush and on the canvas as I go. I'm not looking for anything too stark, and I'm okay entirely if it's semi-transparent. Because the more semi-transparent applications we have, the more opportunity we have to build this up and make it really interesting. So now I'm going to take all that paint off my brush, make it nice and damp, and I'll just go back and I'll blend a little bit of that green on the edge into some of that sandy color, like that. And it's just going to soften it. It's going to make it feel cohesive. You can go over some areas. It doesn't need to be perfect like the reference photo, but the reference photo is going to give us a really good idea of how to make this consistently interesting. So let's mix more green here. Green, blue, no, green, white, black. There we go. And here I'm looking at the reference photo. I can tell there's a bit of green right there. And our green is slightly darker than our previous mixture. So you know what I'll do? I'll go up and I'll just tap a little bit of this in there. Make it cohesive. And then I'll get a little bit more green and a little bit more light. Come back in and do some more. So now I'm just going to continue to move this out a little bit. Again, I know there's another little sand patch there, so we'll leave that be. Here's a larger patch of grass. Fill that in like so. And again, I'm not trying to make it absolutely perfect. I'm just trying to follow the general idea. That way, what I do doesn't become too simple. And I'm going to blend a lot of this out, give me a bit more of a soft edge to blend and play with. The top area is closer to the light, so it'll be a bit brighter, so you want it to be more opaque. Where you get down farther, you can make it more transparent because it'll look darker as we progress down. You can see a gradient there, and that's because more of that black is showing through and it's creating this really natural, easy depth. So this area actually has quite a bit of sand here. So I'm going to do a thin layer of green. And this will be an interesting technique to show you actually. I'm just going to take a lot of paint with a lot of water, create a very thin application of green throughout all of this really. And now we'll go back to our burnt umber and titanium white mixture. And we'll start filling that in. So there's a little line right there, there's a patch of sand right there. It's a significantly larger patch right here. And you can see that it's turning slightly green and the green is turning slightly beige. And they're just starting to fit together really, really nicely. You don't want a stark line in here. You want it all to be relatively smooth. And if you find that it's getting stark, just add a little bit more water and it'll make a big difference. If the paint starts to dry, that's also okay. You can always go back over it, do some extra layers. But you can, again, extend the wet life of that paint quite simply by adding additional water. Now you can see this is a bit darker because it's much more thin, but if I were to take that pigment, I'm not dipping it back in the water, I can make it more opaque, a little bit brighter. Here I'll go back, I'll mix some more green. And we're making all of these strokes with a smaller brush because it is creating this really nice soft application here. But you can also see these slight little brush strokes from it. And they give us a lot of extra detail in the grass. And you can see little areas that are slightly darker in between there. And it makes it look like different areas of the grass protrude. They look taller, smaller, all these different interesting things. And I'm just slowly building up these darker areas until I have them as bright as I want. But you can still tell that the top is the brightest area. We'll go back, we'll grab some more of our burnt umber white mixture, because there's a lot of sand up here. So let's figure out where some of it is. There's some right there, comes down. There's a large patch here, there's a large patch here, and we're just building it up. Some of it comes down there. And the more of this you add, the more beige-ish brown it's going to become. But you don't want all of it to be that really prominent beige or brown. You want a lot of it to be much more subtle. So I'm applying very minimal amounts at a time. And I'm just building up our light. There we go. Now this is a protruding rock right there. I'm not going to include that just because I don't love compositionally how it works. Here, mixing a bit more of that beigeish brown. Going over that edge one more time because the black was still showing through. And I really don't want that. I don't want it to look like an outline on the edge here. The beige should also be a little bit more dominant up at the top because again it is getting some extra light, and then it can get more green and more dark down here. Can also, fully cognizant that it's said also. There we go. Taking a little bit more, creating some extra details, extra little highlights. I also don't want all of the browns and greens to be the same, right? So I'm going to do little patches, little strokes with slight highlights and slightly darker areas. We can also continue on this way. This is quite saturated. I think I want a little bit more titanium white in it. There we go, much better. And now I'm looking at this reference photo, the top there. Again, doesn't need to be perfect, but we have this great design and idea, and we can work with it. I'm going to put a rock right here. There isn't really one in this design right there, but I think it aids the composition. So again, I'm around the top. I'm starting with a fairly opaque green. I'm letting that green run out on my brush as I move farther down, letting it dissipate, get a little bit darker. Just naturally create that depth. I really don't have to do much work in the process. There we go. You can also do a little bit of extra green in there. Quite nice so far. definitely the best technique I've tried. I mentioned at the start of this clip that I redid this area. What I omitted was that I redid it 3 different times using 3 different techniques. I just felt like I kept having different ideas. And, you know, again, I like what I had, but then I'd have an idea that I liked more. And I think that painting grass is relatively easy, but painting grass with sand and rock, it's significantly more complex, but it pays off. It's significantly more interesting as well. And I think it's worth the time and effort. If we're doing this painting over, you know, X number of videos, we might as well put in that extra effort, learn something new, and get better at it, right? So, with that, definitely need more of that sand to carry us forward. So, a little bit of burnt umber down here, a lot of titanium white up here, and I'll just grab little bits of that burnt umber and swirl it back up into that white. That way it doesn't overtake the white. Now we'll continue working our sand in here, and depending upon the direction of the stroke, you can actually create the implication of hills and a lot of movement in here, which is nice. So these swooping down indicate that the ground moves down in that way, right? And I'm starting to get a bit of a toothy effect. I don't have much water on my brush, and I don't want that. I want something soft. So here I'm just using a wet brush to move that paint about to make it softer. Fix it up. Having a big impact. Just like that. Grab a little bit more. I notice that there's quite a bit of sand right about here. And then it moves forward and up into these lanes. And that's a good way of thinking about them, as little lanes. Now we need significantly more, so we will mix significantly more. And you might want to test a little bit of this pigment on your rocks right here. Just make sure that it's consistent with what you've been doing. And it is so far, so that's good. It means it'll look cohesive. And then I'll look for patches of it in this. And I can tell in this rock, which is right there, that there's this interesting formation that kind of dips down. It dips up. It moves this way and it connects. And then again, dips down, connects where these two break, and then it moves down again in this larger piece. So I'm just drawing that in with the paint that's running out on my brush, that way I have an idea for later. It's very subtle visually. But with that, let's move the camera over, that way you can get a better view of this right here. So now we've moved over and we're ready to continue. And I have some of this on my canvas. It's not fully dry yet, so I'll take a little bit of our green that we have and I'll look for the areas to fill in. So this area right here is this area right here. And we will be placing a nice big tree in here as well relatively soon. But I need some more green. So we'll mix up a little bit more here. Again, I don't really like to mix a lot of paint at once, generally, just because I like going back. I like memorizing how to make these mixtures. I like the practice of color mixing. But we'll be doing a lot of these greens and a lot of these browns. So if you want to mix a lot at this point, I would not blame you. Covering up all of the almost black that we had there. And I think I'm going to switch to holding my brush like this for a minute. It's going to give me a slightly more loose brush stroke, which is not a bad thing to have when you don't want to create too much consistency. There we go. I'm deviating slightly from that reference photo, but again, I'm keeping the larger ideas, and I'm also considering some of the smaller lanes and whatnot. This also doesn't have a stream in it, which I incorporated. So again, feel free to take those risks. But here, again, we'll use the reference photo, we'll test our colors, make sure everything's going well. Here a lot of the grass is kind of moving in, it's swooping in. So we're doing this brush stroke in this angle, in this direction, to make it look like the land is moving in this way. It's kind of dipping. And then up here we have a larger patch of land where it's dipping from. So whenever you're painting grass, sand, any type of ground really, try to consider what angle it's on, if it's moving up, if it's moving down, if it's on a hill, if it's creating a hill. Here the ground moves up a little bit, so it shows that there's a bit of a movement down. So there's a fall right here, which works really well because I have my little river down there. There's more green right here, so I'll just roughly etch that in. And we've done a lot with green, it's time to start going back, filling in the sand. So burnt umber, a lot of titanium white. Okay, give it a test right here. Follow it back for a second. Doing this little area in here. And then it gets relatively patchy as it starts to move down this way, so I'm going to fill in a couple of the open areas I left with the grass. Like so. But if you look at all of this, it has a lot of hard edges and it has a lot of tooth in the canvas, and again, that isn't what we want at all. So now I'm going back with a wet brush and I'm doing a lot of blending. The green into the brown into the green. I'm going over all of it in different areas. I don't really care in the end if it looks like a green or a beige, because I can always go back and fix it. All I want to ensure is that I have a softer look. There we go. Grab some more green, that way I can blend in more to this beige. And now we'll go back to the beige. So I'm really jumping back and forth. I'm not doing one or the other. I'm doing both kind of simultaneously. Figuring out where they should go. This is this area right here. And I'm not going to paint in the shadow from the tree right now. I'm going to do that later on when we actually paint the tree, because I may want to make changes to my tree. So we'll just follow that down. Again, go back, do some soft blends where we can. More green right up here. Approaching the edge of this rock, I'll just paint around that. And there's a lot of thick pigment right here, so I'll use some water to drag it out. I'll do a lot of a tapping effect to give us some texture. And we'll do a blend, of course, down into the sand. This looks so much better than the first version I did. And it's unfortunate because I did the rest of the grass with this showing. So we'll finish this, and then as I continue to teach the rest of the lesson, you'll see the older version of it. But I suppose in all future versions of this painting, when we're painting the trees, and next week lesson, doing all of this, it'll look good. So it's okay. With that, more burnt umber, a little bit of titanium white. Going back, just doing a little bit of a tap here and there, brightening up some of the lane and pathway. And you can see right here there are some little offshoots like that. There we go. Turning out really well here. But yet again, I think we should go back in and do a bit more of a blend. Keep it nice and soft. Just using water on my brush. Moving it about. There's a lot of tooth over here, so I'm going to use extra water. That looks nice and detailed. Okay, proceed we shall. Now I'm going to get a bit more of that. So we'll follow this to it, paying attention to the stroke. There's a little bit of a patch there. And then it dips down, and we'll have it touch our river right here. I'm trying to make mine a little bit more green, a little bit more earthy than the reference photo, but I wouldn't have all of this detail without that reference photo. Have a bit more of that brown. It actually goes to here. And then works on top of it, which is interesting. I wouldn't think to do that. Go back, mix some more green. Remember, at this point you really can mix significantly more of it, should you want to. We've mixed it a fair number of times. Have the green grass touch the river right here. I'll just do a couple little taps. There we go. This is significantly more sandy, but I wanted to start with the green, just see how it looked, because again, I do want mine to look a little bit more lush than the reference photo. Now there's a bit of a harsh edge right there, so I'm going to take some extra brown, work that in a couple of these areas, and maybe just do a slight blend there and then back up. I think this will be a nice transition area for it. Again, finding my green, working my way around my rock right here. Builds up to that rock. Kind of comes down. Notice how it is coming down, the land itself. So I'm going to move my brush down. To the left on this side, to the right on this side. More so central here, it's very vertical. And then when I get down to more of a flat plane, I go back to more of the horizontal or slight movements. I also want to continue more of the sand in here. There we go. I am so glad we redid this. I was watching back the footage on my computer and I said, you know, it could be better. So, here we are, making it better. And I hope this acts as an example to you, not to settle in your paintings. If you feel like something could be better or should be better, keep trying, keep mixing. Let it dry, then come back again and have fun. That's how we learn. There we go. Starting to look really natural. I can't wait to see what it'll look like from far away. Actually, kind of a funny piece of history regarding myself. When I was in high school and I was in grade 10, so I would have been 14, 15 maybe, I was in art class and one of the peer teachers came up to me and they looked at my art and then they took a couple of steps back and they said, wow, your art looks really good from far away. And I was offended. I said, what do you mean? Doesn't look good up close? I'm like, no, it's that it particularly looks really good from far away, which is the goal, because when you hang artwork, you're generally not going to look at it from right up close. And a lot of impressionists and a lot of really great painters make the best paintings with details looking just like brushstrokes. When you step far away, you see something amazing. So once they explained that, I was significantly less insulted. But it's something that always comes into my head as I do areas like this that up close don't really look like much, right? It's a bunch of brushstrokes, but when we get far away, it'll look really realistic, much like the rocks did, much like the clouds did. And there's kind of a level of acceptance that you need to move through in areas like this, because when you're up close and you're looking at it and you say, this doesn't look like anything, you need to accept that. That's okay. Up close, it's not meant to. But when you get farther away, it's going to look exactly how you want, if not better. And I think that's a good lesson. Realism isn't always forged through the most intricate of strokes. It's smart brush strokes that's really going to get you there. And sometimes smart brush strokes up close look kind of abstract. Here I'm working those laneways again. I might work a little bit of green into this as well too, just because I feel like it's very brown dominant, and that's not a bad thing at all. I just want a little more diversity in there. Need some green too. There we go. Going to soften some of these applications. The pigment was quite thick, so I want to move it about so that it's thinned out more. There. Again, I'm just working the bottom of the rock and then up in here. I find environmental design like this so much fun. I just watched Detective Pikachu with my partner Maya, and we actually had a really fun time with it. But I was blown away by the world building, by the landscapes, by the lighting, by the effects. It was a really pretty film in a lot of ways, and there's just so much art direction going into it. And I guess this is kind of where these things start, right? You need to start looking at textures, you need to start looking at how lighting's working, you need to start thinking, well, I'm not just going to do grass, I'm going to do sand, and I'm going to do these little pathways, and I'm going to And that's how those big, elaborate ideas are built. But I guess, as an aside, did you see Detective Pikachu? I thought it was quite fun. Definitely a kids movie, but I think that's okay. Maya and I considered bringing our cat Howie. Not seriously though. I don't think he'd enjoy a movie theater. That said, he does love movie Sundays. Oh, I just heard him sneeze. That means he woke up. Okay, there's another fun question. If you have a cat, or if you've had a cat, when it wakes up, does it always sneeze? Because Howie does. And it's ridiculous, but it's also incredibly adorable. You can see that mine is getting significantly more dark as we get towards the edge and bottom than this one is. But that's okay. I want to start with it being a bit more dark, and then should we want to brighten it, we can. I just wanted to make sure that we were starting things off with a presentable value, one that didn't feel too bright, too out of place. And then I'm making this quite sandy over here just to kind of give it the implication of, oh, what might that be? There we go. So now we've covered the entirety of the area. We can go back with a wet brush and just do some soft blending if we'd like. Amalgamate our colors. Take out any real harsh lines. We can also go in and just add a couple more little laneways. There's one coming down from the rock here. And you can see how stark that is in comparison to the rest, and that's because we haven't blended it. The first version I did of this, I didn't really do much blending at all, and I think that was one of the main problems I had with it. So this, the more blending the better. Building up some of the sand here. And now let's take a wet brush, go back in, do some blending. There we go. Lots of little brush strokes in there. But I think from there we will take a couple steps back, see what it looks like from afar, see if we need to brighten any areas, darken any areas, or play with it in one way or another. So here we have it from a distance, and as you can tell, this area right here is significantly brighter than the areas that we've built right here. But that makes sense because the light, it's coming from all the way up here, it's coming down, it's going to strike that first. This area might have a little bit of shadow from this right here. So I like the general pacing of the lighting, and that's something good to consider, but I do want it to be a little bit brighter. So what we're going to do, we're actually going to paint from really far away, and I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to take my brush, I'm going to take some water, take some of our green, white, Mars black, just making a very similar mixture to what we did before, except it's going to be slightly brighter, slightly more saturated. Okay? And now I'm actually going to paint really far away. And that way I get a perspective of how it's progressing over a really far distance. And that way I can see if this area matches with this area, and if my gradient is changing the way I want it to. So I'm going in with a slightly brighter green. And I'm not using much pressure to begin with here. I'm letting these applications be quite soft. Just brightening this slightly. come over here, brighten more of this, get a little bit more sap green in that, because it can't just be brighter, it needs to also be saturated. This area right here is quite important, as is this. And then again, as we get farther away, farther back, we'll let it dissipate. So the paint's running out on my brush. I can't incorporate as much anymore. That side is still nice and dark, but it's a subtle addition of light. And of course, now we need to go back in and do that blend with our wet brush, making sure it doesn't dry with these hard edges, because we've been able to avoid them really well since the beginning. We should definitely continue to attempt to do so here. And again, I'm painting from far away. Now we added some extra green. Let's add a little bit of extra burnt umber and titanium white. And again, holding the brush like this will A, allow us to stand much farther back, but B, it will also allow us to be a bit more loose with our application. Creating some extra little laneways. Making some of this pigment much more thick. That definitely looks highlighted now. And I can see the progression of light with it, which is really nice. Not doable when you stand really close to the canvas. There we go. Now, I think we'll get up close and we'll just do some blending. So here my brush is nice and wet, and so I can just go back over some of those areas, take out any possible hard edges we may have created in these applications. But I think we actually did a really good job of keeping things soft. This edge right here is a little bit hard, so I'm applying a lot of water. I'm just moving that about. There we go. Pick up my palette yet again. Maybe do some touches of green in here, and there, and there, and there. Do a little bit of our brown here as well. Continue that up. Do some little patches. Just small, minor changes and details. There we go. I think that looks fantastic. Next, we'll move on to some rocks. So here we are yet again up close, and we're going to tackle these rocks right here. But before we do, I'd like to note that I did reapply my reference photo to my canvas, and if you compare this area right here to this area, mine is significantly more green, it's a little bit more lush,
and it has a higher, more stark contrast, which is something I've been working towards with this whole painting. I wanted it to be a little bit more dramatic, and the best way of going about that is just increasing the contrast of all of your subjects. So far, so good. But I really like the formation of the rock that we have right up here, and I want to create that in our painting. So, firstly, let's take some of our burnt umber, our titanium white, test that on our canvas, or rather on our reference photo, so we don't have to on our canvas. And I like that as a beginning base pigment. So I'm going to just draw in the outlines of a lot of our highlights, like so. Again, I'm being very careful along the edge, and I'm making sure that I don't have any black showing through there. Now, once I've applied it to the top of my rock, as I have here, I'm going to take a lot of that water off my brush, make my brush simply damp, and I'm going to start blending down that beige and that application. And as you can see, it's making part of it semi-transparent. You can see the almost black through it. And it's creating a little bit of a texture and a gradient. So it's brightest at the top, and now it's dissipating as we move towards the bottom. And that's exactly what we wanted. And if we want to add extra texture, we can take more of it. Just kind of tap that on there. Let's do the other side. So I'm starting with the top, where it's going to be the most bright and prominent, like that. Find my edge. Find my edges, like so. Touch that side up a little bit. And now, take that paint off my brush, take that water off my brush. I'm going back into this one, but we'll just blend this down a little bit. And I'll take a hint of that extra and move it into here. That way the value inside isn't too dark or stark. And I'll do the same over here. And just like that, we have a really interesting rock. I'll make one over here as well. Take that highlight. I'm applying it on the right side because the light is coming down from that right side. And then I start to blend it back. I realize I have too much paint on my brush, so I take that paint off, take a bit of that water off, and through a series of these taps and strokes, I move it back until it dissipates and becomes fully transparent. So that is essentially how you create the form in these smaller rocks. But let's add some extra color. Let's take a hint of our cadmium yellow, deep hue, a little bit of burnt umber, titanium white. Let's apply this to the top. This will give it a bit more of a gold look. Give it some of that sun striking it. It's going to make it more diverse and interesting. Do a little bit more. There we go. Apply that to this one. Can soften it with your finger if you'd like. But now it has a bit of a different color than the sand and the grass do. So that's interesting. Just like that. We can also take a little bit of red, and I think this is dried here on my palette. See if I can open it up. Maybe get a little bit. I can, great. So I will incorporate just a hint of red in there now. Take that titanium white, the red and the yellow will mix to a point. It'll be a little bit orangey, it'll be a little bit pink, and I can incorporate these colors in there as well. And this is going to make it significantly more interesting, yet again. It's going to make it so when you look at these rocks, you don't immediately know what color it is.
And that'll keep the viewer's eye in the painting significantly longer if they have to take some time to articulate what they're looking at. What color is that? So it's a little trick for the viewer, and it'll make your painting a lot more complex and a lot more interesting. But it'll also make sense because rocks generally aren't just one color, right? They're an amalgamation of them, and that's how we create that. I'm also going back in with a touch more highlight, so those colors mixed with a bit more titanium white, and I'm just trying to diversify that even further. Of course, we can also mix some darker rocks, Mars Black, Burnt Umber, a little bit of our blue, and a hint of titanium white. And we can drop in a couple more. So we'll do one right there. This isn't in the reference photo, but I think the little rocks always look quite good. And we can use them to lead the viewer's eye from there down into here. So I'm just making them all different. And when you do that, I like to make them in simple shapes and combine simple shapes. So I'll give you a direct example. Let's do another right here, maybe. Start with a perfect rectangle. Great. Let's add a triangle on top of part of it. Let's add a little bit of a sphere in here. Let's just randomly connect lines. Now we have a really interesting different shape. And I'll do another one right below it as well. Started with a triangle, incorporating a rectangle. Another rectangle, done. Simple, easy. Then we'll take some highlight. Work our way on the top right-hand side of all of these. There we go. Take that extra paint off our brush. Come back in here. Do a little bit of a blend down, create that gradient. Just like that. These look really nice and subtle in with the browns that we have in the ground, and these stand out a bit more. They have a bit more of a sharp contrast, which I like. Again, it's about creating diversity. With that, let's work on some larger rocks over to the left-hand side of the screen. So now we're going to tackle these two rocks, but I don't have the water in the shot because I really wanted to get a close look for you. So we're going to continue with our smaller round-headed brush. I'm going to take some of that titanium white, burnt umber, going to grab a hint of our red, and a small hint of yellow as well. And I'll start, again, at the top of our rock, and I'll move my way down to the right-hand corner, making sure that there is no black edge showing through there. Get a little bit more. I'll start creating some little lines and movements downwards, as you can see. And this is going to create little protruding pieces for the rock. Little pieces that stick out, and it'll make it interesting. Like that. So now it has some little holes, it has some divots. The back area, however, we can't leave it that dark. So I'll take a little bit more,
I'll apply it, I'll grab a lot of water on my brush, and then I'll start blending all of this back as well, but because it has so much water, it'll be more thin and transparent. You can also take extra off with your finger, and that can create some interesting little effects as well. But here we have these really interesting colorful rocks, so we need it to be cohesive with that. So I'll grab some extra red, some extra yellow. We'll make a truly punchy color here. Lots of extra titanium white. We'll try that on some of our other rocks, see how it looks. Not bad. So I'll incorporate that in here. Around the top, maybe some of that warm light's coming down. It's affecting it. We'll also, again, get more red. Should really put some more red on my palette. That's what I should do. But I'm being stubborn. Get some more titanium white. Make this nice pink. Work that into the rock. And I'm going over the majority of the highlights that I created in that first layer, as you can see. I'm just essentially going back in and I'm adding some color to it. Open that up a little bit more. Again, I'll use a bit of a pure pink here. Don't always have to just use browns and grays for rocks. They can be much more intricate and interesting with different colors. And then I'm using a bit of this orange in the back. I'll also grab a little bit of a blue, make it very watery. And I'll incorporate a hint of that in the back as well. And now we have significantly more color than we need, which is not a bad thing. Now we can work backwards and just figure out how simple we want it. We've made it really interesting. Now we just needed to make it match everything else. So I'm going back in with a whitish brown. Might even incorporate a little bit of Mars Black into this, just to reintroduce some nice grays. Grays are really great because they make other colors stand out. They make them pop, they make them beautiful. So it's not a bad thing to incorporate some grays in your work. I think a lot of artists actually say their favorite color is gray, and I fully respect that. There we go. That right there is a really nice, interesting rock. Let's do that over here. So I have some of this gray. Start on the right-hand side, move my way down. I'll create these little landings and interesting protruding areas. Maybe even a shelf of sorts, or two. A little bit to come off the top. Do a bit of a blend back in. And remember, we don't want any of this pure dark pigment, so I'll blend a fair bit of it back. And then I'll use my finger to kind of move it about and make it less prominent. We'll grab some red, some pink, some yellow, a little bit of burnt umber. Do all of the things that we did before to create those really nice colors. Here we have a bit of an orange, which I believe we actually started with in the last one. Like that. Now, it's also important to remember that this rock is a bit farther back. It has the shadows of all of these cast on it, so it isn't going to be as bright as the rest. So we can incorporate some highlight like this, but not too much. There we go. Now we'll blend a little bit of it backwards too. Didn't end up liking the shelf idea as much as I thought, so I'll just take that out with some water. And I think that shape's actually much more natural. Now I actually want to connect a lot of the grass up into there, so we'll create some moss. Take some green, titanium white, Mars black. Create a darker, more desaturated green. And I'll just find areas to connect it. So there's some grass right here, we'll have it run up. Some grass right there. And have some moss just kind of growing up here. Have it growing on this rock in the background too. A little bit in this. But this is going to tie it all together. Have a lot of that green on this one. There we go. Now they feel significantly more connected, cohesive. Following one of the lines of the rock up, I'll do it with this one as well. There we go. And as I do this, I realize that I want a little bit more sand in it. So I'll just take some of that burnt umber, titanium white, find those areas I want to touch up, go back and just do a little bit more of that. Can connect that to the rock as well. Kind of looks like it's leading up it, which is a neat effect. Again, it makes it more cohesive. You can do that with these rocks as well. See? But anyways, that is how we do rocks. Let's take a step back and see how it's coming along. So this is a bit of a pulled back shot, a bit of a wide shot, and now you can see the rocks here in context with the rest of the painting. It's amazing how they really just kind of sink into the background there, and how all of these brush strokes, which we just saw, we just really acknowledged, look like grass and sand and dirt and rocks from afar. So again, realism, it's really forged through a lot of really tiny little strokes that don't look like anything up close, and that's more than okay. I think it's actually quite interesting. I love getting up close to a painting, seeing those brush strokes, and recognizing that I am looking at and honoring a piece of physical art. So with that, I guess pulling back to the shot here, you're probably a little bit confused. You're saying, hey Ryan, we just painted the water, and then we painted this. When did that happen? Remember, I went back and I repainted this. So that happened a while ago, and all of that was actually done with very similar techniques to what I did in here. Same types of brush strokes, same types of mixes, I just let it be a little bit darker. But if you'd like to follow along with me as I complete this rock, the stream, the sand, all of that right there, I do have that up in a part 2 over on Patreon, which you can find in the video description, along with the traceable and all of the reference photos. But again, you don't need it. You can just take these techniques that we learned right here and incorporate them on the other side of the canvas. With that, next week is really exciting because we're going to be working on this area right here. We'll be doing some detailed grass, some actual blades of grass. We're going to increase the technical detail. We're going to make it look even more realistic, and we're going to do the same thing with the rock. So I'm really excited to start working on that, but I'll post that I think next Wednesday. So if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe, but more importantly, hit the bell button because that'll actually notify you when the video is coming out. So I think that's what I have here for you today. Again, I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something. I feel like you feel confident about not just creating grass now, but also intricate grass that also has sand and dirt and all of these rocks, all of these different things that add leading lines and interest into a subject. And let me know. Let me know what you thought of Detective Pikachu, because again, I thought it was quite fun. With that, I will see you next Wednesday. Again, if you'd like to continue painting along, there's a link to that in the description. But I'll see you soon. Thank you so much for stopping by. This is a pleasure. I'm really excited to continue. And above all, as always, stay creative.
Hello, my name is Howie, and I'm pretty sure my parents don't know I exist. Mommy! They used to, but now with this furry beast living here, it really seems like no one listens to me. And sometimes, you just need someone to talk. Well, that's incredibly rude. What the frick is her problem?